It was a morning when even the river seemed to hold its breath beneath the ice. Jack Carter, a war veteran who had long forgotten what peace felt like, was walking his loyal German shepherd, Rex, along the frozen banks of Coldvale Creek when the dog suddenly stopped. His ears shot up. A bark tore through the silence, and then he ran. Jack followed, breath clouding in the cold, until he saw it, a burlap sack tangled in the roots, gently rocking with the current. He reached for it, hands trembling, heart pounding. When he pulled it open, time stopped. Inside was a little girl, no more than 3, her lips blue, her tiny fingers clutching a torn doll, whispering one word before slipping away. Mama. Who was this child? And what kind of heart could cast her out into a world this cold? Before we begin, remember to like and subscribe. And I'm truly curious, where are you watching from? Leave your country in the comments. I'd love to see just how far our stories of hope can travel. Morning broke over Coldvale like a whisper through frost. The air was sharp, the kind that made every breath sting and bloom into white clouds. Along the narrow road that traced the frozen creek, the snow lay untouched except for a pair of footprints and the paw marks beside them. Jack Carter walked in silence, his shoulders slightly bent, as though the weight of a world-long past still clung to him. At 42, his face bore the quiet fatigue of a man who had once known chaos too well. He had come back from war years ago, but war had never quite left him. Every dawn, before the rest of the town awoke, he wandered these paths with Rex, his loyal German shepherd, the only companion who understood silence better than words. Rex was 6, broad-chested and alert, his sable coat rippling against the cold air, a dark saddle marking his back, his chest and legs a burnished tan. His amber eyes seemed always searching, sensing what humans could not. Together they made a solemn pair, a soldier and his dog, bound by years of shared commands, danger, and unspoken loyalty. Jack rarely spoke during their walks. He didn't need to. The rhythmic crunch of boots on snow, the soft panting of Rex, and the muted hum of wind through pines were enough to keep him anchored in the quiet routine that had become his only peace. He had moved to Coldvale 2 winters ago, a remote Montana town tucked between mountains that wore their snow like a secret. People here were kind but distant, knowing when to greet and when to let a man be. Jack liked that. The small house he rented stood at the edge of town, near the river's bend, where no traffic disturbed the nights. Sleep seldom visited him, so he filled his days with simple chores and these morning walks. Rex, ever vigilant, was his shadow. They were both veterans in their own way, retired, scarred, but still alive. That morning felt no different at first. The creek beside them was half frozen, its surface fractured into silver plates reflecting the weak light. The forest beyond it was still, save for the occasional flutter of a bird startled by its own hunger. Jack breathed in deeply, letting the cold clear his head. Then Rex stopped. His ears pricked up, his muscles stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Jack slowed, watching the dog tilt his head toward the riverbank. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. But Rex was already moving, a sudden burst of instinct and power as he lunged down the embankment, the leash snapping taut in Jack's hand. Jack stumbled, caught off guard. Rex barked once, sharp, urgent, then again. Jack's pulse quickened as he followed, boots slipping on the frozen slope. When he reached the bottom, he saw it, a shape caught among the roots where the current still moved, a burlap sack, soaked and heavy, rocking faintly in the water. For a moment, he thought it was just debris from upstream, until it shifted. He froze, then stepped closer, his breath shallow. Rex stood beside him now, whining low, tail rigid, gaze fixed on the sack, as though guarding something fragile and alive. Jack crouched down. The rope binding the top was half loosened, the fabric stiff with ice. He reached out carefully, the rough jute scraping against his gloves, and pulled the sack to the shore. It was heavier than it looked. As he dragged it onto the snow, a faint sound slipped through, not the rush of water, not the creak of fabric, but a sound so small it hardly belonged to this frozen world. A sigh, or a whimper. Jack's heart thudded once, hard. He tore at the knot, hands clumsy with cold and dread, and pulled the opening wide. Inside, crumpled against the wet burlap, was a little girl. Barely 3 years old, Her skin was as pale as the snow around them, lips tinged with blue, lashes stuck together from frost. Her small fingers clutched a torn cloth doll against her chest, its faded yarn hair frozen stiff. For a heartbeat, Jack could not move. The world narrowed to the fragile rise and fall of that tiny chest. Then he heard it, the faintest breath escaping her mouth, followed by a trembling whisper, thin as the wind itself. "Mama." The sound pierced him deeper than any memory of battle. Jack felt the air leave his lungs. "Oh, God," he muttered under his breath. He looked around. No footprints, no sign of anyone else, only the endless whiteness. Someone had left her here, in this cold, to die. His training kicked in before his mind could catch up. He leaned down, feeling for her pulse. Weak, but there. Alive. Rex stood close, his nose brushing the child's hair, whining softly as though urging his master to move. Jack met the dog's eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, the silent understanding that life hung by a thread, and they were the only ones there to hold it. He lifted the little girl carefully, cradling her against his chest. Her body was limp, frighteningly light, her head lolling against his shoulder. The doll slipped from her grasp, but Jack caught it, tucking it beside her. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear. The cold bit into his face, but he barely felt it. Rex circled ahead, barking toward the distant road, then looked back, tail flicking impatiently. A call to hurry. Jack pushed through the drifts, snow breaking beneath his boots, the girl's shallow breaths the only proof of time still moving. The wind picked up, hissing through the trees, carrying with it the hollow echo of his own heartbeat. Every step was a fight against exhaustion and fear, but something deeper kept him moving, not duty, not instinct, but a fierce refusal to let that tiny flicker of life go out. Behind him, the river murmured, indifferent as always. Rex darted ahead, his dark form cutting through the snow, stopping now and then to make sure Jack was still behind him. The path to town felt endless, but there was no choice, no pause, no room for doubt. By the time they reached the edge of the main road, the storm had thickened, flakes swirling like ash in the wind. Jack's breath came in sharp bursts. The child's face was pressed against his chest, her skin cold but still faintly warm beneath his coat. He whispered words he hadn't spoken in years, prayers half-remembered, promises made to no one but himself. Rex barked again, this time not in warning but encouragement, the sound echoing down the silent street. And in that moment, as the snow closed behind them and the faint lights of the town came into view, Jack knew that everything, every wound, every sleepless night, every lonely dawn, had somehow led to this. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why someone would abandon a child in the middle of winter, or what cruelty had driven them to such an act. All he knew was that she was alive, and that was enough. Rex trotted beside him, loyal and steady, the warmth of his breath steaming against the cold. The wind howled through the valley like a distant cry, but Jack no longer heard it. He tightened his grip, eyes fixed ahead, his boots carving a path through the snow toward the faint promise of help. Somewhere behind them, the burlap sack lay half buried in the drifts, the river reclaiming its quiet rhythm. But for Jack Carter, the silence was broken. It would never be the same again. The morning that began like any other had become the beginning of something else entirely, the crossing of 3 lonely lives under one fragile breath. As he pressed on through the storm, guided by Rex's echoing bark, the only thing certain was that the child had been found, and that for now was enough to change everything. The door burst open with the sharp clang of metal against glass, and the warmth of the small-town clinic collided with the bitter air from outside. Jack Carter stumbled in, breathless, his arms wrapped around the small, motionless body pressed to his chest. The golden glow from the overhead lamps flickered against his face, highlighting the worry carved deep around his eyes. His boots tracked slush across the linoleum floor, but he didn't stop to apologize or explain. Behind him, Rex padded in quietly, his thick fur damp with snow, head low, but eyes bright and watchful. The steady hum of the old radiator filled the silence until a woman's voice cut through, calm, steady, and touched with surprise. Grace Miller had been on duty for hours, the quiet night stretching endlessly until this moment shattered it. She was in her mid-30s, with soft lines of fatigue beneath her eyes and hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. There was something in her face that carried both kindness and weariness, the mark of someone who had seen too much loss but refused to turn bitter. Widowed 5 years earlier, she had chosen work over rest, filling her nights with healing others when she could not heal herself. She hurried forward now, instinct replacing thought, guiding Jack toward the examination table. "Set her down here," she said gently, her voice firm despite the tremor that came with the sight of the child's stillness. Jack obeyed without a word, his movements stiff and uncertain. His mind raced, but his body followed orders the way it had always done. Grace's hands moved swiftly, checking the child's pulse, feeling for breath, touching the cold skin that seemed far too fragile. "She's alive," she murmured, though the words came out half as prayer, half as disbelief. She reached for blankets, for warm water, for the small heating lamp she used on winter nights when the power threatened to fade. The light glowed soft and amber over the child's face, revealing faint lashes, lips pale and cracked, and cheeks streaked with frost. Grace rubbed the girl's arms briskly, urging the blood to return, whispering under her breath as though coaxing her back from the edge. Jack stood a few steps away, his hands still shaking. He had faced explosions, gunfire, and chaos, but nothing had ever felt this helpless. Rex sat near the door, his gaze never leaving the table, his tail curled close to his body. The dog's quiet presence steadied the room, grounding the storm of human fear with the calm loyalty of an animal that simply waited for things to be made right. Jack's breath caught when he heard it, faint, rhythmic, the fragile sound of a heart fighting its way back. He exhaled shakily, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, though his eyes never left the girl. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Grace layered blankets and adjusted the lamp closer, the air warming with each passing second. The girl's tiny chest rose and fell unevenly, her small hand twitching as color slowly began to creep back into her skin. Grace glanced at Jack, noticing the haunted stillness in his posture, the same look she had seen in men who came back from the front lines and never quite returned. She said softly, "You did the right thing bringing her here." Jack swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I almost didn't get there in time." The words came out broken, carrying a weight that Grace understood all too well. Then it happened, a soft sound, barely more than a sigh. The child's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes cloudy with confusion, glassy from exhaustion. She blinked once, twice, and her gaze drifted uncertainly before fixing on Jack. Her lips parted, dry and trembling, and a whisper escaped, weak but unmistakable. "Daddy?" The word hit Jack like a blade of light through fog. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Grace froze too, her hand still resting near the child's forehead. The room seemed to shrink around that single sound. Jack stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sweetheart, you're safe now." But even as he said it, something inside him cracked open. The sound of that word, fragile and misplaced, found a space he hadn't known was still alive. Grace steadied herself, her eyes softening. "She recognizes something in you," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she meant it for comfort or explanation. Jack didn't respond. He reached out, letting the little girl's fingers wrap weakly around his thumb. Her skin was cold, but there was life in that touch. A tiny pulse against his own, as if she were clinging to the first thing in her new world that felt safe. Grace turned to fetch warm saline and noticed something glinting at the girl's neck. It was a thin chain, half hidden beneath her collar, with a small silver tag dangling from it. Grace leaned closer and wiped away the frost, revealing 2 engraved letters. E.M. She frowned, holding it gently. "Initials, maybe. E.M., she said aloud. Jack looked up. "A name?" Grace nodded slightly. "Until we know more. We'll call her Emily." The name filled the room softly, settling into the air as if it had always belonged there. Emily, the nameless child, now had something to be called, something that tethered her to the world again. Grace scribbled it onto the admission form, her handwriting steady despite the storm that lingered in her thoughts. She had seen orphans, accidents, neglect. But something about this, a child left in the freezing dark, nearly drowned, found by chance, it didn't feel like tragedy born of poverty or desperation. It felt deliberate. Rex shifted uneasily, giving a short, low bark as if sensing the unease that passed between them. Grace looked toward the window. Outside, the snow still fell, blanketing the world in silence. "No one's come looking yet?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "Not that I've seen," she hesitated, then said what they both feared to think. "Someone will." Later that night, long after Emily had fallen into a light, feverish sleep, Grace sat at her desk filling out paperwork while Jack lingered near the door. The hum of the heater filled the small clinic, interrupted only by the steady tick of the wall clock. Then the phone rang, a sharp sound that made them both flinch. Grace picked it up. The voice on the other end was calm, practiced, but carried an edge that sent a chill through her. A man, polite but curt, asking if anyone had brought in a lost child. His tone was too smooth, too careful, as though he were reading from a script. Grace's eyes flicked toward Jack, who was watching her intently. "No," she lied softly, her hand tightening around the receiver. The caller thanked her and hung up without another word. She sat there for a long moment before setting the phone down slowly. "Someone's looking," she said quietly, "and they're not going through the sheriff." By morning, word had spread through Coldvale like smoke through pine. Someone, no one knew who, was offering a large reward for information about a missing child. A family matter, they claimed. No posters, no calls to the authorities, just whispers in diners and gas stations, an envelope passed quietly at the post office, questions asked by strangers who didn't belong. Grace watched from the clinic window as two unfamiliar cars drove down Main Street that afternoon, their tinted windows reflecting the pale winter light. She didn't say anything, but when she turned to Jack, he was already watching too, his expression set, his jaw tight. In the small cot near the heater, Emily stirred in her sleep, her tiny hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Rex lay beside her, ever watchful, his amber eyes following every movement in the room. Grace finally broke the silence, her voice steady but low. "Something's wrong about this," she said. Jack nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the window. "Yeah," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "And whoever's looking for her, they're not looking to take her home." The words hung in the air, heavy and certain, as the snow outside began to fall again, slow, quiet, and endless. Snow fell in slow, measured flakes that afternoon, covering the rooftops of Coldvale in white silence. The town seemed hushed, as if listening for something it did not want to hear. Through the thin gray light that filtered over the hills, Jack Carter walked beside Grace Miller toward the edge of town, where the old chapel stood, a relic from another time, its wooden beams darkened by weather and memory. The building had been abandoned years ago, after a fire left its bell tower crooked and useless, but Grace still came here sometimes when she needed quiet. That day, however, her silence carried weight. Jack noticed the way she gripped her gloves, how her gaze never settled on one thing for long. Inside, the faint scent of melted wax lingered beneath the chill, and the air carried that particular stillness, found only in places where prayers had long stopped being spoken. Grace paused near the altar, her voice breaking the quiet like a confession. She began to tell Jack about the man who ruled Coldvale without needing to raise his voice, Mayor Douglas Hayes. He was in his early 60s, tall and sharp-featured, with eyes like polished stone, and a reputation that filled every corner of the town. For 3 decades he had been the face of Coldvale, the benefactor, the builder, the man who turned small fortunes into power. But behind that polished image was a different kind of man, one who feared scandal more than sin. Grace's tone carried no malice, only the tremor of someone speaking truths too long held back. She told Jack about Claire, the mayor's only daughter, barely 20 when she became pregnant. No one outside the family ever saw her round with child. Douglas had arranged everything, a long visit to relatives out of state, the whispered lie that the baby had been stillborn, and the return of his daughter months later, thin, quiet, and hollow-eyed. Jack listened, his jaw tightening. The idea that the same man whose smiling portrait hung in the courthouse could bury something like that left a bitter taste. Grace continued, explaining that for years no one dared question the story. Coldvale had been built on the mayor's generosity. The school, the library, the clinic itself all carried his name. But there was one person who had seen the truth and lived with it like a splinter under the skin. Maria Alvarez, the Hayes family's housekeeper. A woman now in her late 50s, short, strong-handed, with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much to be naive. She had worked for the family since Claire was a child, raising her as much as serving her, and though she had tried to forget, she never could. Grace's voice softened as she recalled how Maria had come to her door earlier that morning, trembling and pale, begging for a moment to speak in private. At first, Grace thought she was just another townsfolk with gossip, until she saw the look in her eyes, the look of someone who carried guilt, heavier than fear. Maria had heard whispers about the man who pulled a little girl from the creek, about a child who had survived against the odds, and when Grace mentioned the faded dress the girl wore, something inside Maria broke. She said she had sewn that very dress 3 years ago, tiny blue flowers along the hem for a baby who, according to the mayor, had never taken her first breath. The wind rattled the chapel's windows as Grace's story deepened. Maria confessed that the night of Claire's labor had not ended in tragedy, but in deceit. Claire had survived, weak but alive, clutching her baby while her father paced the hall outside. Douglas Hayes, terrified that a scandal would ruin his re-election, refused to let the infant live under his name. He called in a man from outside town, someone Maria never saw clearly, and paid him to take care of it. The phrase had haunted her ever since. The man left that night during a snowstorm, carrying a bundle wrapped in a blanket. Maria had pleaded, begged for mercy, but Douglas silenced her with a single look, the kind that promised ruin if she spoke another word. For years she had remained quiet, trapped between fear and conscience, but hearing about the rescue near Coldvale Creek, she could no longer sleep. "I knew," she told Grace, her voice quivering as tears streamed down her face. "I knew that child was hers. I stitched the thread by hand." The confession had left Grace speechless, and now, standing in the dim chapel with Jack, she passed that truth along as if it were a burden that could no longer be carried alone. Jack leaned against the pew, his hands clasped, the light from the cracked window falling across his face. "So that little girl," he said quietly, "she's the mayor's granddaughter." Grace nodded. He wanted her gone. Forever. The words echoed in the hollow space like the toll of a bell. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world beyond the glass. Then Grace told him that Maria wanted to meet, not tomorrow, not later, but tonight, when the clinic was closed and eyes were few. Jack agreed without hesitation. The truth had to be heard from the woman herself. As dusk deepened, Maria arrived wrapped in an old shawl, her breath visible in the cold. She looked smaller than Grace remembered, her eyes darting toward every shadow before settling on Jack. When she saw Emily asleep in a cot by the fire, her composure cracked entirely. She covered her mouth to stifle a sob, whispering, "It's her. Dios mío. It's really her." Maria spoke for nearly an hour, her voice trembling but sure. She confirmed every piece of Grace's account, adding the one detail that made Jack's blood run cold. The man Douglas hired had been instructed not just to take the child away, but to make sure she never returned. Maria had followed that man partway into the storm, begging him to spare the baby. He turned only once, his face hidden beneath a coat, muttering that orders are orders. She never saw him again. Since that night, Maria had lived in fear of her employer's reach. "He thinks his money can bury anything," she whispered, eyes glistening. "But God sees what man hides." Before Jack could speak, Rex let out a low growl from near the door. The sound was soft but urgent, a warning honed from years beside a soldier. Jack's instincts sharpened instantly. Grace turned toward the window, catching the faint flicker of movement outside, a shadow slipping past the street lamp. "Someone's here," Jack said under his breath. Maria froze. The next few seconds stretched thin as wire. Then the door burst open, snow swirling in with 2 men, their faces masked, their movements quick and practiced. One lunged toward the cot where Emily slept. Rex exploded forward, a blur of muscle and fury, his bark tearing through the air. The first intruder went down hard, the second swinging wildly, but Jack was already there, driving him back with the weight of a man who had fought for more than orders. This time, it was for life itself. The struggle was brief but violent, the sound of fists and snarls mixing with the storm's howl. One man fled into the night, limping and cursing. The other lay pinned beneath Rex's weight until he too scrambled away, leaving a smear of blood across the snow. Grace rushed to Emily, pulling her close as Maria wept quietly against the wall, trembling from shock. Jack stood still for a long moment, chest heaving, his breath fogging the air. Then he looked toward the broken doorway, where the wind howled through splintered wood, and said in a voice low and certain, "They know she's alive." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, as if trying to cover what had just happened. Inside the chapel, the three adults stood in silence, their faces pale in the amber light. Rex paced once, then settled near the child, his eyes alert but calm. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed, its tone faint and hollow, carrying across the valley like an omen. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all understood. The quiet that followed was not peace. It was only the calm before something larger than any of them could stop. The attempted abduction failed that night, but it changed everything. By morning, word had spread through Coldvale like frost crawling across glass, the kind of rumor that traveled faster than truth. The mayor's men had not spoken, yet the message was clear. Douglas Hayes would not rest until he reclaimed what he believed was his. Within days, a lawsuit arrived at the small clinic's doorstep, bearing the weight of his signature and the name of the state's most renowned attorney. The accusation was severe: kidnapping, unlawful custody, endangerment. To the townsfolk, it was a scandal. To Jack Carter, it was a declaration of war. Douglas Hayes had always known how to orchestrate appearances. At 61, he still carried himself with the poise of a man accustomed to control. Silver hair precisely combed, shoulders squared, and a gaze that could chill a room without a single word. He moved through Coldvale as though it belonged to him, because for decades it had. But the lines at the corners of his mouth had deepened lately, and the measured calm in his voice now barely concealed the cracks beneath. He had built his empire on silence and obedience. Now both were slipping through his grasp. The day he met with his lawyer, the snow had begun to thaw, leaving streaks of gray ice along the courthouse steps, the kind of day when even the air felt brittle. 1 week later, the courthouse stood full beneath the pale winter sun. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with tension, the kind that made every whisper sound too loud. The wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of the townsfolk who had come to witness something they never imagined they'd see: the great Douglas Hayes sitting as a plaintiff. On the other side sat Jack Carter, shoulders straight, eyes steady, his calloused hands folded over the table. Grace Miller sat beside him, quiet and resolute, while Maria Alvarez took her place behind them, fingers knotted tightly together in her lap. Rex lay obediently near Jack's boots, the tip of his tail twitching softly, his amber eyes following every movement in the room. The courtroom smelled faintly of old varnish and paper. Judge Harold Whitmore presided, a man in his late 60s with a heavy brow and the calm authority of one who had seen every kind of lie. The mayor's lawyer, Richard Crowley, was the type of man who thrived on spectacle. Polished and meticulous, with thinning hair slicked neatly back and a voice that cut through air like polished steel, he began the case with deliberate precision. He painted Jack as a man with a savior complex, a recluse who had taken matters into his own hands, exploiting tragedy for self-righteous gain. The defendant, Crowley said, pacing slowly before the jury, had no right to withhold a child from her rightful family, a child who, by blood and law, belongs to Mayor Hayes and his daughter. Jack did not flinch. Grace's hands trembled briefly in her lap, but she kept her gaze steady. When it was their turn to speak, their lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Daniel Pierce, who had once served as the town's public defender, rose to his feet. His voice lacked the grand theatrics of Crowley's, but it carried sincerity that silenced the murmurs. "Mr. Carter didn't steal a child," he said simply. "He saved one. From death, not from her family, but from the cold consequence of another man's choices." He stepped aside as the first witness was called. Dr. Robert Allen, the town's physician, entered with quiet composure. In his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and calm, His presence brought a hush to the room. He had no stake in politics, no interest in gossip, only facts. Under oath, his voice was steady. "When Jack Carter brought the girl in," he said, "her body temperature was dangerously low. Another hour outside and she wouldn't have survived. He didn't abduct her. He carried her out of death." The courtroom stirred, whispers rising until the judge's gavel brought silence again. Hayes sat motionless, but his jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the polished cane in his hand. Then came Maria. She looked fragile as she walked to the stand, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. But when she began to speak, her voice was unshakable. She told them everything: how the mayor had silenced his daughter's pregnancy, how he had paid to have the infant taken away, how she had sewn the baby's dress herself. There were tears when she described the night the man carried the child into the storm and the years she had spent haunted by the sound of the baby's cry fading into the wind. The courtroom was still, the air thick with disbelief and sorrow. Douglas sat unmoving, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed something, fear perhaps, or the first flicker of regret. When Claire Hayes entered, the silence was absolute. She was 23 now, tall and delicate, her face pale against the light filtering through the high windows. For years she had lived under her father's story, believing her baby had died. Now, standing before the town, the truth lay bare. Her eyes found the small figure sitting quietly near Grace, Emily, healthy and awake, her golden hair catching the sunlight. The sight broke something inside her. Tears welled, and when she turned toward her father, her voice shook. "You told me she was gone." The mayor looked at her but said nothing. His silence spoke the truth more clearly than any denial could. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Claire crossed the aisle, her steps slow, uncertain, until she stood near Jack and Grace. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "I didn't know." Grace reached out gently, resting a hand on her arm. "You do now," she said softly. For a brief moment, even Crowley lowered his eyes. The judge cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "This court will decide not just who this child belongs to," he said, "but who truly deserves to protect her." Then, in the hush that followed, a small sound broke the air, a voice, light as breath but bright as dawn. Emily, now strong enough to sit upright, stretched her tiny arms toward Jack and Grace and called out, "Papa Jack! Mama Grace!" The words rippled through the room like a wave. No one moved. Even the gavel paused mid-air as the judge's eyes softened behind his glasses. For a long heartbeat, the sound of that innocent voice carried more weight than any argument ever could. Tears streamed down Grace's face as Jack turned to meet the child's gaze. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sniffles of strangers wiping at their eyes. Claire wept openly, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. The mayor turned away, his shoulders rigid, his composure unraveling in slow, imperceptible lines. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of pride and power, stood naked before everyone who mattered. When Judge Whitmore finally spoke, his voice carried the solemnity of a man delivering both justice and release. "The child known as Emily shall remain in the custody of Jack Carter and Grace Miller," he declared, "whose care has ensured her survival and well-being. Furthermore, this court is forwarding all testimonies and evidence concerning Mayor Hayes to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into conspiracy and attempted harm of a minor." The gavel struck once, firm and final, echoing through the chamber like the closing of a chapter that had taken too long to end. As the murmurs rose, Grace leaned down to embrace Emily, who giggled softly through her tears, clutching her doll close. Jack reached out, his hand steady on her back, the weight of weeks of fear finally lifting. Maria bowed her head in silent prayer, whispering thanks under her breath. Claire stood apart, trembling but freer than she had ever been. And Douglas Hayes, the man who had ruled the town for half a lifetime, sat motionless, staring at nothing, his empire of silence crumbling one word at a time. When they left the courthouse, the snow had stopped. Sunlight broke weakly through the clouds, laying pale gold across the steps. Rex trotted ahead, tail swaying, stopping now and then to glance back as if ensuring his family followed. The cold air stung, but it no longer felt harsh. Jack paused for a moment at the top of the stairs, looking back at the building that had held so much judgment and truth. He said nothing, only exhaled, long and slow, as if letting go of something that had lived inside him for years. The long winter had finally yielded to spring. Snowmelt trickled down the hills, and the air carried the soft scent of thawing earth. Coldvale, once muted under gray skies and whispered rumors, now glowed in quiet celebration. A year had passed since the courthouse doors had closed on Douglas Hayes's empire, and life in the town had found its balance again. The day began with church bells echoing over the valley, their sound bright, unburdened, and full of promise. For the first time in years, people smiled without hesitation. They gathered near the white chapel on the hill, where sunlight pooled through stained glass, painting the pews in gentle hues of gold and rose. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was tender, almost sacred. Jack Carter stood near the altar, his face calm but his eyes carrying that familiar depth, the kind carved by storms, both real and remembered. The lines of weariness that once shadowed him had softened. There was peace now, the kind born from purpose found rather than battles won. Grace Miller walked slowly down the aisle, her expression serene, her smile the quiet reflection of a woman who had finally allowed herself to be happy again. There was no grandeur, no excess, only warmth, laughter, and the steady hum of hearts at ease. Outside the windows, petals drifted through the spring breeze, carried by children running past with ribbons in their hands. Emily, now 4 years old, scattered petals ahead of Grace with the solemn focus only a child could bring to such an important task. Her golden hair caught the sunlight, and her giggles echoed softly across the room each time Rex brushed past her leg. The German shepherd, strong, alert, and ever loyal, trotted beside her, a red ribbon tied neatly around his neck. His amber eyes gleamed as he looked up at Jack, as though understanding that this moment belonged to the man who had once pulled life from the snow. To everyone in Coldvale, Rex had become more than a dog. He was legend, the silent guardian who had changed fate with his bark and his courage. When the vows were spoken, they were not grand or eloquent, but honest. The words rested gently between two souls who had already weathered the worst life could give. There were tears, laughter, and a silence so full it felt like music. The townspeople watched with a reverence that came not from spectacle but from shared memory. They had seen darkness together, and now they witnessed light, simple, unpretentious, and pure. The bells rang once more, long and bright, and the congregation spilled into the sunlight, where laughter rose like birds from open hands. Rex barked once, a deep, joyful sound, as Emily clapped her tiny palms, her eyes wide with delight. In the months that followed, Coldvale grew gentler. The town's wounds healed slowly but surely, like frost giving way to wildflowers. Claire Hayes, now 24, began her quiet return to life. The first few times she visited, her hands trembled, unsure how to reach for the daughter she had been denied. But Emily, in her innocent generosity, bridged the distance. She began calling her Aunt Claire, a title that held no judgment, only kindness. Claire would sit with her in the garden behind the clinic, reading aloud, brushing her hair, sometimes simply watching her play. With time, the guilt that had shadowed her gave way to something softer, gratitude, perhaps, or redemption. She had lost her title, her father, her illusions, but she had gained a truth that finally set her free. Douglas Hayes, stripped of his office and name, stood trial in the Capitol 2 months after the verdict. The evidence, once buried beneath decades of fear, surfaced piece by piece until even he could not deny it. Conspiracy, attempted harm, obstruction. The charges read like an indictment not only of his crimes, but of the arrogance that had sustained them. When the sentence came, the town received the news in silence. No cheers, no jeers, only a collective exhale. The man who had once ruled their every thought was gone, reduced to a story parents told their children when warning them of the cost of pride. Maria Alvarez attended every day of the trial, her hands folded in prayer. When the judge thanked her for her courage, she simply replied, "Truth doesn't belong to the brave. It belongs to the living." Coldvale never forgot that line. Maria became something of a quiet hero in her own right. The townspeople often stopped her at the market, pressing her hands, leaving flowers at her gate. She never asked for recognition, only peace. Sometimes she could be seen walking up the hill toward the chapel, where she would sit for hours watching the sky. It was said she found comfort in hearing the church bells, not for what they meant, but for what they no longer did: fear, silence, obedience. She once told Grace that every sound of those bells reminded her of the night she broke her own, the voice she'd been too afraid to use for years. Grace listened, smiled, and said, "Sometimes courage is just choosing to speak once and never taking it back." Emily grew up surrounded by kindness, laughter, and the steady rhythm of love that expected nothing in return. She became the kind of child who stopped to pet every stray animal, who left small wildflowers on the graves of people she never met, who believed that the world could be kind because the people around her were. Coldvale watched her grow as if she belonged to all of them, a symbol of survival, of innocence reclaimed. Rex remained by her side, aging gracefully, still strong, still proud, though his muzzle had begun to gray. Whenever he walked down Main Street beside her, people would wave, some tipping their hats in silent acknowledgement of what he had once done. Evenings in the Carter household were quiet, the kind of quiet that brings peace rather than loneliness. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing. Across the walls, Emily played on the rug, building small castles from wooden blocks, while Rex rested nearby, one ear twitching now and then at the sound of her laughter. Grace sat by the window with a book in her lap, her eyes occasionally lifting to watch the two of them. Jack sat in his chair by the fire, the warmth softening the hard lines of his face. His gaze followed the little girl, the dog, the woman he loved, all pieces of a life he never thought he'd have again. At times, his thoughts drifted to the years behind him, the noise of war, the ache of loss, the countless faces he couldn't save. But then Emily would laugh, and the weight of memory would ease, replaced by something gentler, something whole. He reached down to stir the fire, watching the embers glow like small suns, and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Real heroes," he said, his voice deep and even, "don't need anyone to know their names. They just need to keep their hearts kind." Grace looked at him, her smile faint but full, and replied softly, "And sometimes, kindness is the only legacy that matters." The night deepened, stars dusting the sky outside their window. Emily yawned and leaned against Rex, her eyelids fluttering as the dog shifted closer to keep her warm. Grace rose to cover them both with a quilt. Jack watched in silence, his heart full and still. The fire crackled once more, the house breathing in rhythm with the night. Beyond the window, the wind whispered through the birch trees, carrying the faint echo of church bells, not solemn this time, but joyful, a reminder that even after the longest winters, spring always finds its way back. Sometimes, the quietest stories leave the deepest marks. They remind us that kindness doesn't always roar, and that courage often wears the face of ordinary people who simply refuse to turn away. Somewhere, at this very moment, there are still hands reaching out in silence, still hearts choosing compassion over comfort, still souls who give without ever asking to be seen. And maybe that's what keeps the world from falling apart, not grand gestures, but the quiet goodness that lingers long after the noise fades. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you're feeling or who you're thinking of tonight. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, loyalty, and hope. And may God bless every one of you who still believes that a gentle heart can change the world.